Two men jumped out of a fake police cruiser and pointed at me like I was the one trespassing on my own land. One shouted, "You're being evicted by community order." I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or call the real sheriff first. But I knew one thing for certain: the man barking orders had his badge on upside down, and the cuffs on his belt were made of plastic. My dogs didn't bark. They just sat still, like they already knew these clowns weren't worth the energy. That was the moment I knew things were about to get very, very interesting. It was early morning on my ranch. The sun had just started painting the fields golden, and the dogs had already finished their first patrol along the fence line. I was halfway through feeding the goats when the sound of tires crunching over gravel made me freeze. I turned toward the gate and saw two black SUVs with flashing blue lights attached sloppily to their roof. They weren't county cruisers. No markings, no plates, no decals. Just plain rental SUVs with magnetic stickers slapped on the side that read HOA Enforcement Unit. I knew every lawman in a 100-mile radius, and these weren't them. Still, I stood quietly and watched. Three men got out. One wore aviator sunglasses too big for his face. Another was already yelling into a megaphone before the SUV even stopped rolling, and the third had a baton hanging from his belt like it was Halloween. They approached the gate with aggressive confidence, not realizing my cameras were already tracking their every move. The one with the megaphone shouted, "We have an emergency community citation order. You are in violation of HOA Zone Regulation 44B. This land has been reassigned. You are trespassing." I took a deep breath, wiped goat feet off my hands, and walked slowly toward them. Then I saw her. Marching behind them in her usual tennis outfit and sun visor, clipboard tucked under one arm like she was a 5-star general. Karen. Her name wasn't really Karen, but let's just say the nickname fit better than her yoga pants ever did. She waved like we were old friends at a church picnic and called out, "Glad you're cooperating. We can make this quick if you just gather your things and leave peacefully." I stopped 10 feet from the fence and stared. Leave peacefully from my own land. "You gonna explain what all this is about, Karen?" I asked calmly. She pushed her sunglasses up and smiled like she was on camera. She held up a piece of paper that flapped in the breeze like a cheap menu. "This is a formal notice. Your property has been absorbed into the jurisdiction of the Willow Creek HOA by unanimous board vote. You're in violation of multiple appearance and usage codes. We've hired an enforcement agency to conduct a citizen's eviction." One of the fake officers tapped his baton against the gate like he thought it might intimidate someone. I stayed quiet. There was no point arguing with people this far detached from reality. Instead, I studied them. Their uniforms didn't match. Their patches were iron-ons. One guy had sneakers instead of boot, and that badge upside down. If I hadn't been so irritated, I might have actually admired the guts it took to pull this kind of stunt. "You're making a mistake," I finally said. "This isn't community land. This ranch is registered outside the HOA perimeter. Has been for 40 years. And you, Karen, have no authority here." Karen laughed and said, "Authority is what people believe in, dear. And right now, I believe you're leaving." She turned to her hired goons. "Proceed." That's when the guy in the sunglasses stepped forward and tried to unlatch the gate. I whistled once. My dogs stood up from the porch and started walking over. They didn't growl. They didn't bark. They just moved with the kind of discipline you only get from trained animals. The man froze halfway through the gate. Ma'am, I thought there weren't any dogs." Karen waved it off. "They're just mutts. Ignore them." I raised an eyebrow. That's when I decided to stop playing nice. "You really think I'm just some farmer out here with goats and a porch swing, don't you?" Karen crossed her arms and said, "That's exactly what you are. You're a squatter with no aesthetic vision. This land has potential. I have blueprints." The man with the megaphone reached into his pocket and pulled out what he probably thought looked like a legal document. But even from 10 feet away I could see it was printed in Comic Sans, with a gold sticker instead of a seal. I held back a laugh and said, You boys have about 2 minutes to leave before you find out why fake badges don't fly around here." They paused. Karen snapped, "Don't listen to him. He's bluffing. Execute the eviction." I didn't move. I just pointed behind them. A siren began wailing, distant but getting louder fast. Real fast. One of the fake cops looked back and said, I thought this was off the books." Karen hissed, "It is. Stick to the plan." But it was too late. The sheriff's cruiser came tearing down the road, dust flying behind it. Karen turned white. The fake cops panicked. One dropped his baton. Another dropped his badge entirely, and it clattered on the gravel, the plastic snapping loose from the pin. The sheriff stopped just short of the gate, stepped out, and tipped his hat. "Morning," he said to me. "Everything all right here?" "Couldn't be better," I replied. "I think these folks were just leaving." Karen sputtered something about lawful orders and citizen authority. The sheriff looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "You do realize impersonating law enforcement is a felony, right?" he said. One of the fake cops took off running. Another bolted into the ditch. The third just sat down and put his hands on his head. Karen shrieked, "This isn't over. I'm still president of the HOA. I have legal rights." The sheriff turned to me and asked, "You got footage?" I nodded. "Every second of it. And I'd be happy to share." He grinned. "You always were one step ahead. Good thing you're not the one being trained anymore." I chuckled, watching Karen stomp off toward her golf cart, still screaming about bylaws and beautification ordinances. The sheriff walked over to me and said, "I take it you still run those law enforcement seminars out here?" I nodded. "Training starts next week. K9S and tactical scenario rotations." He smiled and said, "Might want to add a new module, HOA interference." As the fake cops were loaded into real cruisers and driven off, I looked out across my ranch. Nothing had changed. Not the grass. Not the barn. Not the porch. Just another day in paradise, where the goats chew slow, the dogs stay sharp, and HOA presidents learn the hard way that make-believe power doesn't stand a chance against the real thing. The morning after the fake eviction debacle, I was sipping my coffee on the porch when my neighbor Rick pulled up in his dusty pickup and leaned out the window with a grin stretched across his face like a kid on Christmas. He didn't even say hello. He just laughed and said, "You broke the internet." I raised an eyebrow and walked over. Rick handed me his phone, and sure enough, there it was. A grainy but unmistakable video clip of Karen shouting at the sheriff, trying to explain why she had the authority to evict a man from land she didn't own. The video had over 200,000 views and was spreading like wildfire. Somebody had edited dramatic music over it, complete with slow motion and subtitles. My favorite line so far was Karen screaming, "This land belongs to the people," and the sheriff calmly replying, "Lady, this land doesn't even belong to your zip code." At first, I chuckled and figured it would pass like most internet nonsense. But the more I watched the comments roll in, the more I realized that this had struck a nerve. Folks were furious that someone could be so bold as to impersonate officers, trespass on private land, and still claim victim status. The internet dubbed Karen the HOA Queenpin, and the men with her were now called the Badge Brothers. Someone even started printing t-shirts with her face and the words "I evict you" in the name of aesthetic harmony. And yet, somehow, Karen was unfazed. That same afternoon, I noticed her little white drone buzzing above the treeline like a mosquito with a surveillance complex. I stood in the field, arms crossed, watching it hover over my barn, zip around the dog training yard, and then settle directly over the goat pen. I could hear her voice through the tiny speaker on the drone, repeating, "This is a warning. Your fence is non-compliant with neighborhood standard." I didn't even bother responding. I just pulled out my phone and logged the flight, time-stamped it, then turned on the electronic signal jammer installed for precisely this kind of annoyance. The drone went limp midair, spiraled a few feet downward, then slowly drifted onto the grass like a feather. One of the goats sniffed it, then sat on it. The sheriff's office laughed when I showed them the footage. But behind the humor was something more serious. They had traced one of the fake cops to a man named Larry Connors, who had pulled a similar HOA stunt 2 years ago in another county. Same uniform, same car rental, same fake badge routine. It turned out there was an entire small-time operation scamming wealthy homeowners into thinking they could buy private security to enforce fictional HOA code. Karen, it appeared, had paid for the deluxe package. I asked the deputy if they could do anything. He said the case was open and being investigated, but Karen was already playing the helpless role. She claimed she was scammed too, that she believed the men were legit. Yet she kept posting online about how I was still in violation of Community Code 44B and that she was organizing a neighborhood committee to oversee land beautification effort. I laughed at first, but then came the citations. She mailed them to me. 42 in total. Each printed on bright pink paper with fake official stamps and phrases like animal vibration violation and non-conforming topsoil texture. One accused me of excessive silence after 10 p.m., which, as Rick said, might be a record for dumbest HOA citation in the state. Another cited my ducks for improper alignment. I tacked them all to my barn wall and titled it the Wall of Delusion. But it didn't stop there. Karen had begun attending local HOA forums online and stirring up trouble. She claimed I was a menace to the neighborhood and that my ranch lowered property values. She submitted an official HOA motion to have my land reviewed for public use conversion. When that failed, she started reaching out to other board members with promises of community improvement grants and private investment. I decided it was time to push back with more than sarcasm. I started collecting every drone flight, every printed citation, every video clip of her making threats, and forwarded them to the county. I met with the sheriff and asked him to escalate things with the zoning department. I even called my old buddy Stan, who worked in state legal affairs, to get his opinion on the boundary map. That's when things took an unexpected turn. Stan called me back 3 days later and said, "You're not gonna believe this. Karen filed a fake amendment to an HOA zoning map last year that shows your land inside their boundary. But that amendment was never approved. She forged a county clerk's signature." I nearly dropped the phone. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was fraud. I brought the evidence to the county office and asked them to compare it with the original map on record. The clerk pulled out a weathered file folder, opened it up, and said, well, look at that. The original boundary stops a full quarter-mile from your land. No overlap, no gray area. And the clerk's signature on Karen's copy? That guy retired in 2019. She forged a dead man's approval. The clerk shook her head and said, "She's in over her head." By now, the sheriff had enough to start putting pressure on Karen. They issued her a formal warning and advised her to cease all harassment and drone flights. She responded by posting a public video claiming I was conspiring with law enforcement to silence her, and that I had trained dogs to attack neighborhood children. The video was so ridiculous that it only made her look worse, especially when someone dug up her previous complaints about squirrels, wind chimes, and too loud flower colors. Still, the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone expected. Karen wasn't just annoying anymore. She was dangerous, and she wasn't stopping. So I decided it was time to stop playing defense and bring her antics to light in front of her own allies. If she wanted to play games in the HOA, I'd meet her right there at the next meeting. But not with empty words. With evidence. With witnesses. And with the truth that would expose every single lie she'd wrapped herself in. The next HOA board meeting was set for the following Saturday at the community clubhouse. I marked it on my calendar, sharpened every fact, and made sure I had backup. Karen had made this personal. But she had no idea that the next time we faced off, I wouldn't be standing alone. The law was behind me. The truth was on paper. And my dogs? Well, they were ready for a front row seat. Saturday came with the kind of dry heat that made you question your life choices before breakfast. I arrived at the Willow Creek Community Clubhouse 15 minutes early, wearing jeans, boots, and a collared shirt that still smelled faintly of hay and dog shampoo. I didn't dress up for theatrics. I came to deliver facts. The parking lot was nearly full, SUVs and golf carts lined up like it was a church revival. I spotted Karen's custom-plated Lexus parked sideways across 2 spots, a glittery bumper sticker on the back that read HOA Boss Babe. It figured. Inside, the clubhouse buzzed with tension. Karen was already at the front, standing beside a projector screen with a laptop open and her ever-present clipboard tucked under one arm like a sidearm. She had assembled a stack of fake violations, maps, and what I assumed were speeches full of nonsense. Most of the board members were seated already, trying not to make eye contact. A few neighbors I recognized gave me nods of sympathy, while others sat with folded arms, clearly unsure of which side they belonged on. The meeting began like most HOA meetings do, with someone clearing their throat for too long and the secretary struggling to find the correct agenda sheet. Karen didn't waste time. She launched into a speech so rehearsed it sounded like an infomercial. She spoke about community values, aesthetic harmony, safety concerns, and of course, her favorite phrase, non-compliant agricultural presence. She made me sound like some wild outlaw raising radioactive goats on stolen land. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I raised my hand. The moderator nodded at me reluctantly. I walked slowly to the front, carrying a folder and a thumb drive. Before I said a word, I plugged the drive into the projector laptop and pulled up a side-by-side comparison of the 2 zoning maps, one fake, one official. I didn't even need to narrate. Gasps came from the room the moment the real boundary line appeared. My land wasn't in HOA jurisdiction. Not even close. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming that her amendment had been processed through the proper channels. I held up the forged copy and pointed to the dead man's signature at the bottom. This clerk retired 6 years ago. She used his name without approval. That's forgery. A low murmur spread across the room. One of the older board members adjusted his glasses and muttered, "I told you last year this smelled funny." Next, I played the video of the fake cops arriving on my ranch. Their badges, their behavior, the sheriff's arrival, and their ultimate arrest. Then I played a short drone clip Karen had broadcasted over my land, complete with her voice claiming jurisdiction. You could see the sweat start to build on her upper lip. She was unraveling, but still clutching that clipboard like it was a life raft. I ended with a quiet statement. I've lived on that land for over 3 decades. I trained state police, military dog units, and community responders. I've never once bothered a neighbor, filed a complaint, or interfered with anyone's property. I don't care about your flower color guidelines or which way the mailbox leans. But I do care about people like her trying to take what doesn't belong to them and punishing anyone who tells them no. There was a pause. For a moment I thought maybe Karen would back down. But instead, she doubled down. She claimed I had manipulated the evidence, that I was colluding with the sheriff to sabotage community progress. Then she started clicking through slides of photoshopped images, trying to show my ranch as a junkyard full of rusted cars and weaponized livestock. The audience didn't laugh or gasp. They just stared in disbelief. Finally, one board member stood up. Her name was Trudy, a retired librarian who'd always kept quiet until now. She cleared her throat and said, "Karen, I supported you when you wanted to repaint the benches. I even helped you organize the flagpole dedication last year. But this is madness. You forged documents, hired criminals, and harassed a man who trains the very people that protect this town. I won't be a part of this anymore." Another member stood up next. Then another. One by one, the board members began to walk out. Karen stood frozen, eyes wide, lips twitching but no words coming out. The moderator eventually closed his folder and declared the meeting adjourned. The room slowly emptied until it was just Karen and me, and a few silent observers who were probably just there for the cookies. I turned to leave when I heard her mutter, "You think you've won. This isn't over." I stopped and looked at her. "Karen, this was never a game. It's not about winning. It's about respect. You crossed every line and you still don't get it. But don't worry. The county will help you understand. As I walked out, I saw Rick waiting by my truck. He handed me a soda and said, "That was the best free entertainment I've seen all year. You should charge admission next time." I chuckled, though I was more tired than I let on. I'd stood up for my land, sure, but the fight wasn't done. Karen had done more than just cause a nuisance. She had committed crimes. And it was time someone made sure she faced the consequences. That evening, I filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office, attaching all the documents, videos, and statements gathered so far. I included notes from the HOA meeting, the forged map comparison, and even a clip of her threatening to take things further. The sheriff promised they were compiling everything for a case file, and that charges could soon follow. Just before bed, I let the dogs out for their final stretch. As they trotted through the yard, tails wagging and noses to the wind, I leaned against the porch railing and looked out across the field. The stars were sharp, the air clean, and for a moment it was peaceful again. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't finished. She'd lost the meeting, the board, and the neighborhood's respect. But people like her don't go down quietly. Still, I wasn't worried. I'd faced worse than Karen in my time. And if she really thought she could scare me off my land with drones and fake cops, then she hadn't learned a thing from today. She wanted a war of authority. She was about to find out what happens when you try to outlaw a man who trains the law itself. The county courthouse stood like an old brick fortress in the middle of town, its stone steps worn smooth by years of grudges, lawsuits, and rural drama. The day of the hearing came with a sharp chill in the air, though it was spring. I pulled up in my old pickup, parked in the lot beneath the large oak tree, and stepped out carrying a leather binder and a thumb drive. I didn't need to bring much. The facts would do the talking. Karen, on the other hand, had arrived earlier. Her Lexus was already parked front and center, polished so clean you could probably see her ego in the reflection. She wore an outfit that looked like she was trying to win a political campaign, blazer, pearls, and a purse bigger than her argument. Inside the courtroom, the energy buzzed like a bug zapper in summer. A few HOA members had shown up out of curiosity. The sheriff was seated near the front, arms crossed and hat resting on his knee. My neighbor Rick took a seat in the back, munching on sunflower seeds like it was a matinee. Karen sat smugly at the front table with a stack of papers, a laptop, and a man beside her who looked like he'd just learned what a courtroom was yesterday. He didn't even have a briefcase, just a grocery bag with what looked like folders and a banana. I assumed that was her legal counsel. I hope for her sake he knew the difference between a subpoena and a sandwich. The judge entered and called the room to order. He was an older man, the kind that didn't blink at nonsense or tolerate it. He looked over the case file briefly, raised an eyebrow, and said, "So let me get this straight. We're here because someone tried to evict a man from land he legally owns using fake police officers and forged documents." Karen's attorney stood, cleared his throat, and began with what sounded like a high school debate club speech. He said Karen was simply misled by a third-party enforcement agency and that her actions were based on a misunderstanding of zoning boundaries. The judge stared at him silently for 5 seconds before asking, "And the forged signature of a county clerk who retired in 2019. Was that a misunderstanding too?" Karen jumped in. She said it was a clerical error, that she thought the document had been approved, that the men she hired seemed professional. She even tried to spin the drone flights as neighborhood safety patrols. The judge leaned forward and asked, "Do neighborhood patrols usually include aerial surveillance and loudspeakers threatening livestock?" I was called to the stand next. I kept it simple. I explained the boundary lines, showed the correct map, presented video clips of the fake eviction attempt, and detailed Karen's repeated harassment. I kept my tone calm, steady, and firm. When the judge asked about my background, I told him about my work with state police, K-9 training, tactical instruction, and the various rural property laws I had to teach over the years. I finished by saying, "I've never tried to control my neighbors. I just expect the same respect I give. Then came the sheriff's turn. He laid out the full investigation. The history of the fake officers, the matching license plates from the other county, the forged paperwork, and Karen's refusal to comply with cease and desist warnings. He pulled out a folder, dropped it on the desk, and said, "We've compiled over 70 hours of footage, testimony, and documented incident. This is not a mistake. It's a pattern." The judge rubbed his temples and looked exhausted. He glanced at Karen and asked, "What exactly were you hoping to gain from this land?" Karen straightened up and said, "A community improvement center. Gardens. A dog-free zone. A safe and structured environment." The judge just blinked at her. "You wanted to take his private land. For what? A botanical daycare?" Karen insisted it would benefit the whole community. That my animals were disruptive. That the aesthetic of my barn was driving down property values. That I was aggressive. The judge stopped her mid-sentence and said, "If training police dogs and maintaining rural livestock is aggressive, I'd hate to see what you call peaceful." He called for a short recess before making a ruling. While everyone shuffled out for a break, Karen walked past me with a glare that could boil water. "You think this ends today?" she muttered. I smiled. "I know it does." She scoffed and stormed off to the restroom, her poor attorney trailing behind her like a confused tourist. We returned to the courtroom 20 minutes later. The judge took his seat and announced his decision. He ruled in my favor on every count. Karen was ordered to pay all legal fees, cover the county's investigation costs, and complete 100 hours of community service, though not with any HOA-related functions. The judge also issued a restraining order barring her from flying drones within 500 feet of my property and from setting foot on my land for any reason. But it was his final comment that left the deepest mark. He said, "This ranch is not part of your HOA. It never has been, and it never will be. Consider this case a lesson in boundaries, both legal and personal. And if I ever see a plastic badge and a clipboard being used to terrorize citizens again, I'll recommend jail time." Karen's face twisted like she'd bitten into a lemon. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She sat down slowly, looking like her world had just been turned inside out. I thanked the judge, shook the sheriff's hand, and walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight. Outside, Rick clapped and said, "That was better than daytime television." "You gonna hang that restraining order on your barn wall?" I laughed and said, "No, but I might turn it into a sign. Something simple. No drones. No fake cop. No Karens." Back at the ranch that evening, I grilled some burgers and shared the victory with a few friends and neighbors. Even the sheriff dropped by for a plate and a cold drink. One of the dogs stole a burger off Rick's plate when he wasn't looking. We all laughed. For the first time in weeks, there was real peace. The air was lighter. The silence wasn't tense. It was earned. But I knew Karen wouldn't disappear quietly. She had her pride, her clipboard, and whatever new scheme she was probably cooking up by the light of her HOA-approved porch lantern. She'd come back eventually. Maybe not in person, maybe not with drones, but somehow. She didn't know how to let go of power she never had in the first place. That didn't worry me. I had the law, the land, and my dogs. And the next time she tried to make noise, she'd learn all over again. You can scream rules all day, but if they don't apply where you're standing, you're just yelling at dirt. A week passed after the court ruling, and the ranch was finally calm again. The dogs lounged on the porch without keeping one ear up, the goats stopped reacting to drone noises, and I could finish a full cup of coffee without interruption. Peace felt earned, not accidental. But as expected, Karen wasn't done. She had lost the legal battle, been humiliated in court, and been removed from the HOA board after a unanimous vote by the other members. Yet still, her ego wouldn't let her vanish quietly. The first sign of her next move came through the mail. A glossy flyer slid into my mailbox wrapped in plastic, with a logo that looked like a cheap knockoff of a county seal. The title read Neighborhood Renewal Initiative with a photo of Karen standing in front of what looked like a fake community center blueprint, smiling like she'd just won a mayoral race. It was an invite to a public forum on reclaiming neglected land for neighborhood wellness. The meeting was set to take place at the Community Park Pavilion just across from the HOA clubhouse. The implication was as clear as day. Karen was still trying to take my land, just with a new name and a fancier tone. I wasn't surprised. I was just tired. But I wasn't about to let her spin up another delusion without someone there to keep it tethered to reality. I didn't plan to cause a scene. I only planned to listen and record. When the evening of the forum arrived, I wore my ranch jacket, boots, and brought my dog Brutus with me. He wasn't an aggressive dog, just massive and incredibly well-trained. The moment people saw him, they instinctively gave us space. Karen, already standing at the front of the pavilion with a microphone clipped to her collar, went pale the second she saw me. But she pushed forward like she hadn't noticed. She started the presentation with a long-winded speech about beautification, community unity, and reimagining underutilized rural land. She never said my name, but she didn't have to. Her slideshow featured aerial shots of my ranch with the labels removed, and a fake architectural rendering that showed a wellness center with yoga zones, koi ponds, and a fence where my barn currently stood. A few people clapped out of politeness, but most just looked confused. One elderly man raised his hand and said, "Wait, isn't that the same land the judge said wasn't part of our HOA?" Karen fumbled through her papers and said, "There are still legal ambiguities we're exploring." Another woman asked, "Didn't you get fined for flying drones over that same property?" Karen waved it off and said, "Misunderstandings happen during progress." I didn't speak. I just stood near the edge of the pavilion and let her unravel. Every attempt to steer the conversation toward community growth somehow ended with her bringing up fences, animals, and non-conforming barns. Eventually, a younger couple stood up and said they were withdrawing their support for the initiative because it felt more like a personal vendetta than a civic project. The air thinned. Karen's smile started cracking. A few more people left. Then, out of nowhere, Brutus let out one soft bark. It wasn't loud, just deep. Karen jumped. The microphone picked it up and made it echo. She snapped, "This is a forum for forward thinkers, not livestock enthusiasts." That was the final straw. I walked forward, pulled out a copy of the court ruling from my jacket, and laid it on the table beside her. I said nothing, just nodded, turned around, and walked away with Brutus. People followed. The forum ended 5 minutes later. The next day, Karen took down the initiative website. Her flyers disappeared. Her HOA supporters stopped answering her calls. She tried one more time to regain her board seat, but was unanimously denied. She'd burned every bridge within her own kingdom, and for once there were no more drones, no more hired actors, no more clipboard threats. Karen, at long last, was quiet. A month passed. The sheriff dropped by for coffee one afternoon and gave me the final update. The county investigation into the fake enforcement agency had resulted in multiple arrests. The ringleader confessed to several fake HOA enforcements across 3 counties. Karen's name was included in the report, not as a criminal conspirator, but as a willing participant who lied to escalate personal grievances. She wouldn't serve time, but her reputation was effectively destroyed. She'd been fined again and placed under monitoring for further complaint. I thanked the sheriff, and as he left, he turned back and said, "We don't get many cases like yours. But I'll tell you what, it's gonna be used in training material. Not as a law violation. As a lesson in standing your ground with class." Summer rolled in not long after. The grass grew high, the animals thrived, and the porch stayed warm with laughter. I hosted a small gathering for the officers who helped with the case, some local neighbors, and the rookie training class from the state police. They brought cookies. I grilled ribs. Brutus earned about a dozen steak scraps for being the most polite monster dog in the county. One of the young trainees approached me at sunset and said, "Sir, Is it true that woman tried to turn your barn into a koi pond? I nodded and said, she also tried to file a noise complaint against my goat for bleeding too emotionally. The whole porch roared with laughter. But the best moment came just before the night ended. One of the older deputies handed me a gift. It was a wooden sign, carved carefully with the words "No trespassing, trained dogs, real law, no Karens." I nailed it to the front gate the next morning, right under the existing ranch sign. The mailman took a picture. By lunchtime, it had already made the rounds online. People started stopping by to see it, taking photos like it was a landmark. Some folks even asked if they could order copies. I didn't mind. It had become a symbol, not just of winning, but of dignity, resolve, and the humor it takes to survive rural madness. Karen, as far as anyone could tell, had stopped trying. She rarely left her house, and when she did, she avoided eye contact. I heard she started attending online forums under a fake name, but none of her proposals ever got traction again. Without her title, her authority vanished. And without an audience, her noise meant nothing. As for me, I went back to my routine. Dogs to train. Fields to tend. Neighbors to help. Life on the ranch wasn't flashy, but it was honest. And in a world full of Karens, fake cops, and flying nonsense, I figured that was the highest reward of all. Peace earned and kept. Not by power. Not by argument. But by standing still when the world tried to shove you over. And having the dogs, the friends, and the truth on your side when you do.